Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. Today in Dave's Garage, I'm building a new PC. All the parts are finally here, and I'll tell you why I bought what I bought, why I economized where I did, and why I went all out where I did. That's all coming up, but first, I've got to answer the most important questions that I know will inevitably come up in the comments. And the answers are Steve Austin, Oscar Goldman, Jamie Summers, Carl and his Rockets. So you know how there's that guy and he makes a lot of actually really high quality, really good videos, but he worked on this thing and every time he makes a video he manages to drop in this little hint that, yeah, I worked on that thing that's on the other planet now. And yeah, I don't want to be the task manager of videos like that. However, we're talking about cores and CPUs and stuff, so even though Bill Gates taught me never to name drop and do stuff like that, I'm going to mention that I'm the guy that wrote the original Windows Task Manager. It's probably worth noting for trivia for no other reason than this CPU would actually break the original Task Manager because there's too many threads of execution. The original Task Manager, the APIs at the time were limited to 32-bit masks, so there was an expectation there wouldn't be more than 32 CPUs. It wouldn't actually break it, it just would not report it properly. So I guess that's broken, isn't it? It's not even going in my desktop. This machine's going in a rack. So what I'm going to do with this, I'm hoping you can help me, but I think I have a few ideas. I'm hoping I can pass through in Proxmox or Hyper-V server, but that's another story. Before we get to the what am I going to do with it, we should probably talk about the what is it. And when you build a PC, the first thing you need to decide is what CPU you're going to use. In my case, I went with the Threadripper 3970X from AMD. I think the last might have been an AMD Athlon 2. And the only other non-Intel chip I've had, I think, was a Cyrix or Cryx, however you pronounce it. One of their DX40s. It's a long time ago. That'd be back probably in the early 90s, if anything. So not much in the non-Intel side for me. This is kind of branching out. So the big decision I had to make was which of the chips in the 39 series was I going to get. 16 core, 24 core, 32 core, or 64 core. And it's like the old days with cars. Speed costs money, kid. How fast do you want to go? It's one of those situations, and the other thing you have to ask yourself about the number of cores is, well, there's really three things, I think. Number one, do you have a workload that can take advantage of it? Certain things like compiling really broad source bases, tile-based rendering, things like that, they scale really well to having just massive numbers of cores. Other things like the Adobe Creative Suite, not so much. They don't actually show any improvement going from the 32 cores here to the 64 cores of the 3990 chip. There's a number of cases that just don't show improvement, and in some cases, does going to more cores make my performance worse? If you are highly dependent on the single core thread speed, then going to a much slower main core speed, but with more of them, is actually going to hurt you. So you really have to understand what it is your workload requires of your CPU and what the CPU can provide you. So in my case, since I'm using it for virtualization, simulation, and a number of other things that do require a large number of potential cores or threads, I could actually make a good case for getting the 3990. But am I getting my money's worth? That's kind of important to me. It's a lot of money. It's a $4,000 chip. So if I'm going to spend that kind of money, I got to be getting something for it. And I certainly have to be getting a lot more than I'm getting for the $2,000 of the 3970 because the price just slightly more than doubles. 32 cores in the 3970 and 64 cores in the 3990. Twice the number of threads. A thread is like a core except it's not. It's more like an operating system thread, but one that shares a high degree of parallelism within the chip. So they can't always be executing in parallel, but they can often stagger workloads. So as a made-up example, let's say you're doing a shift and a multiply. It might be able to do those at the same time on two different threads. But if you're doing two additions and there's only one ALU allocated to that core, then they're going to have to wait just like they weren't hyper-threaded at all. The 3970 has 128 megs of cache, and the 3990 has 256 megs of cache. That's still the same amount of cache per CPU core. So if there are 128 for 32 cores, it's 4 per core. Hey, did that in my head, not bad. Whereas in the olden days, it was 8 megs of cache for 4 cores, which was 2 megs per core. So we roughly doubled the amount of cache memory per core, and because there are so many cores, we actually massively increased the amount of cache memory. And you are, in fact, getting double the amount when you go to the 3990. So good value there. One area where you don't see an improvement at all is in the number of PCI lanes. Both chips have 64 lanes. That probably is enough for most people, but by the time you get 3 M2s on the main board and get a couple PCI slots, and you want to have extra PCI X16 slots left over, ideally. So they've got Intel beat, I believe, here in the number of PCI lanes per chip by a fair margin, but it's still not unlimited. So if you were building a big server and you had 7 slots, they're obviously not all going to be X16. I don't believe they can't be. They're not enough lanes. So more lanes would be better. The two things that wound up actually convincing me and helping me make my final decision were the clock rates and the TDW, which is the total dissipated wattage or workload. I'm not actually sure what that even stands for, but it's the amount of heat the chip throws out. That amount of work is limited to 280 watts on both chips. Now, does that matter? Well, not if each chip, if the 3970 only used a max of 140, then it would make sense for the 3990 to use a max of 280. But the problem is I did some research and I found that in a case of running Prime 95 highly parallelized, they were pulling 287 watts on a 3970, which means there was no more work to be done even if you had a 3990. It was enough to worry me that is there actually that much headroom left in the chip if the thermal design is limited to the same amount for a 32-core and a 64-core chip. Can't fully tell you if I know the answer to that one, but it's a question that I had, and it was enough to make me question whether or not I wanted to spend an extra $2,000. In terms of clock rates, when you get all the cores busy on the 32-core, it can drop down to about 3.7. And I think in real world, these are binned pretty selectively, so you're getting actually better numbers than that. But the spec is 3.7. However, it's only 2.9 on the 3990. So if you take a 2.9 gigahertz and multiply that by 64 cores, and you take the 3.7 and you multiply that by 32 cores, it's 118 versus 185 effective gigahertz. So there is quite an increase, but again, it's not 200%. So what are they actually seeing in tasks? In some tasks, like Cinebench, where you're doing panel-based rendering and the workload can be really split up very well and you're not really competing for memory on the same channels, they get an almost equivalent increase in workload just by adding more cores. But in tasks like compiling, you're seeing about a 30% increase for compiling the entire Linux source tree with a 64-core machine versus a 32-core machine. Rendering in Premiere Pro and stuff like that was a wash. It was no faster and in some cases was slightly slower on the 3990. So that wasn't compelling to me. And since compiling is about the only real use case that I'm going to have that actually merits having a powerful computer, the fact that it was only 30% better for $2,000, hey, some people can justify it and I don't blame them. I don't always plan it this way, but it seems to be. I sort by price on CPUs, I scroll all the way to the bottom, and I back up one, and I get the second most expensive CPU, because that seems to be where the bang for the buck really is. That doesn't really apply once you start adding Xeon Ws and stuff into the workload, or even the big Threadrippers, because they are pretty expensive, but it seems to be what I wind up doing. And it's what I've done here again. So, 3970 it is then. That's the CPU I'm going to build around. That means I still need the same motherboard because they're both going to need the TRX 40 chipset, which I believe is, it says right on the box. There you go, TRX 40. So if the CPU is going to be a 3970 32-core chip, that's the brains of the system. What's going to be the backbone, or the nervous system, I guess to call it? The motherboard. I'm used to paying about $250 at most for a motherboard. In fact, looking back at my old one, I paid $233 for a Sabertooth Z77. That was an LGA 1155 socket with a Z77 chipset, it sounds like. This board is a TRX 40 chipset for the STRX4 socket, yes. And it was more like $800 and some dollars, which is brutal for a motherboard. Now, on the bright side, when you open it up and take it out of the box, it's kind of a work of art. It's built like a tank. It's enormous. It has everything on it, and it does everything. But it's still a lot of dough for a motherboard, so why did I pick that one? The reason I was motivated to pick this board is because I have just converted the house over to 10 gigabit networking, which I've made a bunch of other videos about. And as a result, I wanted a board that had 10 gigabit ports on board. I didn't want to waste my time with 1 gigabit NICs built into the main board and then having to do it in slots, because then I've just lost a slot right off the top. So I wanted all my 4 open slots plus the 2 NICs already on board. And I get that in the Extreme, and it's the only board I could find that offered that right now. Otherwise, I'm not a gamer, didn't really feel like I needed a workstation board per se. It's got a lot of memory capacity, which is very nice. And I mean, it's a pretty fancy board. There's no getting around it. So the Extreme also comes with this daughter card that can hold up to 4 M2 NVMe SSDs that support PCI 4.0. I believe it's a 16-lane card. In fact, the only thing this board doesn't have that I would have liked is Thunderbolt 3. It looks like this board supports 4 M2 NVMe SSDs right on the main board itself, plus another 4 in the daughter card I just showed you. So that's, I guess, 8 strapped down to the PCI bus. A lot of I/O, a lot of storage. And I think it supports RAID 1, 0, and 10 if I'm not mistaken. Obviously, the fastest and easiest thing to do would have been to buy 3 or even 4 of the Aorus PCI Gen 4 PCI 4 SSDs. But they're a little pricey, so what I wound up doing was getting one of those to play with and see if the speeds are worth it in 2 terabytes. And then I got 2 Samsung 970 Evo Plus. They're using a technology that's slightly different than the Pro, but they are surprisingly almost as fast. They're probably not as durable in terms of the number of writes, but I'm not doing that many writes. I mean, I'm bringing footage on board and I'm editing and stuff like that, but it's really not a database type workload. The performance numbers seem to be as good almost as the Pros, and even though they're only PCI 3, they're going to be somewhat constrained by that, but I'm going to run them in RAID 0 and see what kind of performance I get in that. And by RAID 0, of course, that's reading and writing from both of them at the same time with no redundancy for maximum performance. I also have a Samsung 860 QVO 1 terabyte boot drive that I'm going to use for alternate booting. I haven't decided on whether I'm going to use Windows Hyper-V or Linux Proxmox yet, so I want to evaluate both. So I'm going to do it off of 2 different drives and see how that goes. For memory, I went one step faster than this board will support. I went to 3600 megahertz memory instead of 3200, thinking that if I ever retired this memory to another board, it would be more likely to be useful if it were slightly faster. Didn't want to step all the way up to 4000 or some of the more exotic parts because the board simply doesn't benefit from it. This memory is more than fast enough for this board, but not so much faster that it's pointless. It's just got a little headroom, I guess. And I believe it even has some RGB, if I'm not mistaken. Oh yeah, looks very colorful. It's got to be inside of a rack mount case, so it's kind of a waste. But I was kind of price shopping on memory, and it seemed to be well reviewed, well rated, and in the speed and price range I was looking for. So for a video card, I went with the AMD Radeon 5700 XT. But I think it's similar in performance to the 5600M with HBM2 memory that I have in the MacBook Pro. So I was fairly happy with that. And if it's in the same ballpark for performance, it'll do everything I need it to do. And as I understand it, the AMDs can be slightly easier to virtualize than the nVidia cards because nVidia uses the proprietary grid system, which requires you to have a licensing server and a bunch of other magic. This uses some kind of open standard that I don't know a lot about yet. The only thing I'm not thrilled about is that it's got the 3 big fans and it's a churn it up inside the case kind of heat fan as opposed to an ejected out the back of the case fan. I would prefer a video card cooling solution that ejects most of the heat out the back of the card and out of the case. And I'm not sure how much this moves out the back, but it does have vents and fans, so I'm hoping it moves at least some of its discharge air out the back. Otherwise, I'm going to be dependent on the case fans to keep a fresh flow of cool air running through the chassis. And speaking of cooling, you can't say the word cooling or fan on the internet without talking about Noctua. I have no idea why that is. They make these brown beige fans that everybody loves, so hey, I'm going to try one because it looked and seemed like it was pretty quality built. I bought their standard cooler, and because I may push the CPU and because I want it to be cool and happy, I'm going to add the secondary fan so it's a push-pull design and not a simple push-through. Hopefully that adds a little extra cooling capacity. For power supply, I did some measurements and some calculations, and I figured this system would pull at most around 500 watts if it was doing rendering and CPU intensive work at the same time. So add some headroom to that, I came out at 750 watts. I just don't see the value in putting in a 1500 watt Mondo power supply just to prove the point that you have the headroom. If it's quieter because you're using a bigger unit and the fans kick in less, that makes sense to me, but it's going in a server room, so I don't care if the fans run a little bit. 750 seemed to be the right number, that's what I bought. EVGA has been reliable for me in the past, so since they seem to make a decent power supply, or buy a decent power supply, I don't know if they make their own or not, the ones under their brand seem to last well for me, so I stuck with it this time as well. And lastly, I have a 5 hard drive bay kind of RAID mount system, which goes and takes the place of 3 5.25-inch bays and allows you to stack 5 hard drives in a hot swap arrangement. And it's got the power distribution and the SATA and everything built into it. So you mount it as kind of a monolithic block, slide it in, and now you can fire drives in and out. That's a theory anyway. I'll evaluate it and see how it goes. But it's something I'd like rather than having to dig inside. Plus, you can actually see the drive LEDs, because I'm a big fan, as you know, of monitoring my system and knowing what's going on. So I like to be able to see the actual hard drive lights, because drive activity is otherwise pretty hard to monitor sometimes. Well, I think that's all the major components. All that remains now is to assemble them into some kind of usable system, get it running, install an operating system on it, and see how it runs. Alright, that's just about do it for showing you the list of parts, why I picked it, what I picked, and so on. I'm not going to go through the steps of putting it all together in front of you because you've seen people putting motherboards in cases about 1,000,000 times before. The only interesting part is waiting to see how they do the thermal paste, and for me, I do a thin bead and then I strip it with a business card until I get like a laminar sheet. I don't know, everybody else does it that way, but that's what the instructions in my old Arctic Silver said to do, and that's what I've done ever since and had good luck with that. So argue that one all you like. In other news, it's already together. You can probably hear it humming along in the background. What's it look like? Well, I'll give you a quick peek here, but generally you're going to have to tune into the next episode to find out how it all went together, what kind of problems I had, and how I solved them. Tune in next time for that exciting saga. I'll see you then.